Have you ever wondered what happens when silence becomes the loudest cry for help? In the sprawling estates of Beverly Hills, where money flows like water and success is measured in zeros, a young boy's world existed in complete silence. Not by choice, but by circumstance. And sometimes it takes an unlikely hero to bridge the gap between isolation and connection. Can you guess which city this heartwarming story takes place in? Drop your answer in the comments below. The Golden Cage. The Morrison mansion stood like a monument to success against the backdrop of the Hollywood Hills, with its pristine white columns, perfectly manicured gardens, and a circular driveway that could accommodate a small army of luxury vehicles. It was the kind of home featured in Architectural Digest. Behind its imposing gates lived Richard Morrison, a tech billionaire whose innovative software had revolutionized the way the world communicated. Ironically, communication within his own home had become a lost art. Richard had built his empire from nothing, transforming a small startup in his garage into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. His wife, Victoria, came from old money, the kind of family that had streets named after them in downtown Los Angeles. Together, they were the power couple that graced the covers of Forbes and Vanity Fair, their lives seemingly perfect from the outside looking in. But perfection, as they would learn, is often an illusion. Their son Daniel, now 8 years old, had been born deaf. The diagnosis came early, shattering what Victoria had imagined would be the typical trajectory of raising a Morrison heir. The specialists, the therapies, the expensive consultations, they had tried everything money could buy. Yet somehow, in their pursuit of finding a cure or a solution, they had forgotten the most important thing, learning to simply connect with their son as he was. Daniel spent his days wandering the vast halls of the mansion like a ghost. His world was one of visual cues and vibrations, but his parents, consumed by their demanding careers and social obligations, rarely took the time to learn his language. They loved him, certainly, but love without understanding can feel remarkably like indifference to a child who cannot hear the words, "I love you." The boy had learned to read lips to some extent, but conversations in his home were often rushed, conducted over shoulders while someone was heading out the door or typing on a phone. Daniel had developed his own crude system of gestures, pointing and pantomiming his needs, but these interactions felt more like commands being issued to a pet than genuine communication between family members. The unlikely angel, Rosa Delgado, had been working for the Morrison family for 3 years. At 52, she had the kind of face that immediately put people at ease, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and hands that had known both hardship and healing. She had emigrated from El Salvador 20 years earlier, leaving behind her own children to send money home and build a better life for her family. Rosa had worked for several wealthy families in Beverly Hills, but the Morrison household was different. The silence that permeated the mansion wasn't just due to Daniel's deafness. It was the silence of people who had forgotten how to truly see each other. She watched as Richard left for work before Daniel woke up and returned long after bedtime. Victoria's days were filled with charity galas, board meetings, and social engagements that kept her away from home more often than not. But Rosa saw Daniel, really saw him. She noticed how his eyes would light up when he successfully communicated something, and how they would dim with frustration when he couldn't make himself understood. She observed his intelligence, the way he would figure out complex puzzles, his artistic talent when he drew, and his gentle nature with the family's golden retriever, Max. What Rosa recognized that others had missed was that Daniel wasn't broken or incomplete. He was a whole brilliant child who simply communicated differently, and Rosa had a secret that made her uniquely qualified to help him. Her younger brother, Miguel, had been born deaf. Growing up in a small village in El Salvador, they hadn't had access to the resources that the Morrison family took for granted, but they had something more valuable, a community that embraced Miguel as he was. Rosa had learned sign language as naturally as she had learned Spanish, treating it not as a disability accommodation, but as simply another language in their multilingual household. The first signs. It started small, as most profound changes do. Rosa began incorporating simple signs into her daily routine with Daniel. When she served him breakfast, she would sign "eat" while saying the word aloud. When she helped him with his jacket, she would sign "coat." At first, Daniel watched with curiosity, not understanding what she was doing. But children are remarkably adaptable, and Daniel was no exception. Within a week, he began mimicking Rosa's hand movements. His first successful sign was more, a simple gesture where both hands come together at the fingertips. Rosa nearly cried with joy when Daniel used it to ask for more orange juice at breakfast. The lessons were informal, woven into the fabric of their daily interactions. While folding laundry, Rosa would teach Daniel the signs for different colors and clothing items. During walks in the garden, they would practice signs for flowers, trees, and animals. Max the golden retriever became an unwitting teaching assistant as Daniel learned to sign dog, play, and run. What amazed Rosa was Daniel's hunger for communication. Once he realized that these hand movements could express his thoughts and feelings, he became an eager student. He would tug on Rosa's sleeve and point to objects, desperate to learn their signs. His eyes, which had often seemed vacant or frustrated, now sparkled with curiosity and determination. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into their informal lessons. Daniel had been trying to tell Rosa something all morning, pointing frantically toward his room and becoming increasingly agitated when she didn't understand. Finally, Rosa sat down with him and patiently worked through what he was trying to communicate. Using a combination of signs she had taught him and his own improvised gestures, Daniel managed to convey that he had lost his favorite toy car, a small red Ferrari that his father had brought back from a business trip to Italy. Together, they searched his room and found it wedged behind his bookshelf. When Daniel signed "thank you," a gesture Rosa had taught him just days before, she realized they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just teacher and student. They were friends who could truly communicate. The secret lessons. As the weeks turned into months, Rosa and Daniel's sign language lessons became more sophisticated. Rosa brought books from the library, borrowing American Sign Language dictionaries and children's books that taught basic signs. During Daniel's parents' long absences, they would sit together in the mansion's library, surrounded by first-edition classics that no one read, learning the language that would unlock Daniel's world. Daniel proved to be a remarkable student. His visual learning style, developed as a natural adaptation to his deafness, made him particularly adept at remembering signs and their meanings. He began creating his own sign combinations when he didn't know the proper sign for something, showing a natural understanding of how language works. One afternoon, while Victoria was at a charity luncheon and Richard was in meetings downtown, Daniel managed to sign a complete sentence. "Rosa, I like learning with you." The grammar wasn't perfect. Sign language has its own syntax that differs from spoken English, but the meaning was crystal clear. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face as she signed back, "I like learning with you too, Daniel." The transformation in Daniel was remarkable. The quiet, withdrawn child who had wandered the mansion's halls like a lost soul was becoming animated and expressive. He began initiating conversations with Rosa, asking questions about her life, her family, and the world beyond their wealthy enclave. Through sign language, Daniel learned that Rosa had children of her own, grown now with families in different states, and that she missed them terribly. Rosa, in turn, learned about Daniel's inner world. He confided his fears about being different, his sadness that his parents seemed always busy, and his dreams of someday traveling the world. He had an artist's soul, she discovered, and loved to draw detailed pictures of places he hoped to visit. Through their conversations, Rosa realized that Daniel's intelligence far exceeded what his parents had recognized. Without the barrier of communication difficulties, his curiosity and creativity flourished. They developed routines and inside jokes. Daniel would hide behind furniture and sign surprise when Rosa entered a room. They created a game where Daniel would sign descriptions of people or objects, and Rosa would try to guess what he meant. These moments of joy and connection stood in stark contrast to the formal, distant interactions Daniel had with his parents. The discovery. The autumn day that changed everything started like any other. Richard Morrison had left for what was supposed to be a 3-day business trip to San Francisco, discussing a potential merger that could add billions to his company's valuation. Victoria was spending the day at the Beverly Hills Country Club, followed by appointments with her personal trainer, dermatologist, and stylist. But Richard's meetings concluded early. The other company's CEO had to rush back to Tokyo for a family emergency. Rather than stay in San Francisco or extend his trip, Richard decided to surprise his family by coming home a day early. He had been feeling guilty lately about his long absences and thought perhaps he could spend some quality time with Daniel and Victoria. He arrived at the mansion just after 3 in the afternoon, expecting to find the house quiet as usual. Daniel would typically be in his room or the game room, occupied with solitary activities while Rosa went about her household duties. Instead, as Richard opened the front door, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but Daniel's laughter, rich, uninhibited, and full of joy. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had heard his son laugh like that. Curious and somewhat bewildered, he followed the sound toward the library. What he saw through the partially open door left him speechless. Daniel and Rosa were sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, facing each other with several books spread around them. But they weren't just reading. They were having an animated conversation using rapid, flowing hand movements. Daniel's face was more expressive than Richard had ever seen it, his eyes bright with intelligence and humor. Rosa was signing something that made Daniel dissolve into giggles, and then Daniel signed something back that made Rosa clap her hands in delight. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, watching his son communicate with more sophistication and joy than he had ever witnessed. The hand movements were clearly a language, structured, nuanced, and flowing between them with the ease of native speakers. This wasn't the crude pointing and gesturing that Daniel typically used. This was real communication. As Richard watched, Daniel began telling Rosa a story, his hands painting pictures in the air. Rosa listened intently, her face showing understanding, surprise, and amusement at all the right moments. When Daniel finished his story, Rosa responded with what was clearly praise and encouragement, and Daniel beamed with pride. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. His son, whom he had thought of as limited in his ability to communicate, was actually fluent in an entire language, a language that Richard didn't speak or understand. The barrier between him and Daniel wasn't Daniel's deafness, it was Richard's ignorance. The confrontation and revelation. Richard pushed open the library door, and both Daniel and Rosa looked up, startled. Rosa immediately began to stand, her face showing the kind of concern that employees display when caught doing something that might be perceived as overstepping boundaries. "Mr. Morrison," Rosa said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect you back so soon." But Richard's attention was focused entirely on Daniel, who had gone from animated and joyful to withdrawn and worried in the span of seconds. The transformation was heartbreaking. It was as if someone had dimmed a bright light. "What were you doing?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Rosa was teaching me," Daniel said, but he spoke with his voice rather than signing, the words coming out with the distinctive pronunciation patterns of someone who has never heard spoken language. It was the first time Richard had heard Daniel speak in months. Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions: amazement at his son's obvious intelligence and communication skills, shame at his own ignorance, and a deep, painful regret for all the conversations he had missed. He also felt something unexpected: gratitude toward Rosa, mixed with embarrassment that his housekeeper had succeeded where he had failed as a father. "How long has this been going on?" Richard asked, his voice softer now. Rosa and Daniel exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that Richard now realized happened constantly between them. 6 months, Rosa admitted. "I didn't mean to overstep. Daniel wanted to learn, and I know sign language because of my brother." Richard sat down heavily in one of the leather armchairs, suddenly feeling older than his 45 years. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show me what you've learned." What followed was a revelation that would reshape Richard's understanding of his son and himself. Daniel, with Rosa translating, told his father about his feelings, his interests, his dreams, and his frustrations. For the first time, Richard learned that Daniel loved astronomy and dreamed of becoming a scientist. He discovered that his son was acutely aware of his parents' busy schedules and had convinced himself that their absence meant they didn't enjoy spending time with him. Most painfully, Richard learned that Daniel had been trying to communicate with him for years, but had given up because he felt like his father couldn't understand or didn't have patience for his attempts at communication. "I thought you were angry at me," Daniel signed, with Rosa interpreting. "I thought I was broken." The words hit Richard like a punch to the chest. His brilliant, creative, loving son had been carrying the burden of feeling broken and unwanted, all because Richard had been too busy, too ignorant, or too overwhelmed to learn how to communicate with him. The commitment. That evening, after Victoria returned home and experienced her own emotional revelation about Daniel's abilities and their family's communication failures, Richard made a decision that would change their lives forever. He called his assistant and cleared his schedule for the following month. He contacted the best sign language instructors in Los Angeles and arranged for intensive lessons for both himself and Victoria. But more than that, he made a commitment to truly get to know his son, not as a problem to be solved or a disability to be managed, but as the remarkable individual Daniel had always been. The The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Learning a new language as an adult is challenging under the best circumstances, and Richard and Victoria were starting from zero while carrying the emotional weight of years of missed opportunities. There were frustrating moments when communication broke down, when signs were forgotten or misunderstood, when the gap between their good intentions and their abilities felt overwhelming. But Daniel proved to be a patient teacher, and Rosa became an invaluable bridge during the learning process. Family dinners, once silent affairs where everyone ate quickly before rushing off to other activities, became extended conversations about everything and nothing. Daniel shared his artwork, his stories, his questions about the world, and his dreams for the future. Richard discovered that his son had inherited his entrepreneurial spirit and logical mind. Daniel had been creating detailed business plans for inventions he wanted to develop, all in pictures and drawings, because he had never learned to write complex English. His ideas were creative and surprisingly sophisticated, showing a natural understanding of problem-solving and innovation. Victoria learned that Daniel had been closely observing her charity work and had developed passionate opinions about social justice and helping others. Through their new ability to communicate, she discovered that her son wanted to be involved in making the world better, not just as a recipient of privilege, but as an active participant in positive change. The ripple effect. As the Morrison family learned to communicate with each other, the changes extended far beyond their personal relationships. Richard began incorporating accessibility and inclusion initiatives into his company's policies, driven by his newfound understanding of how communication barriers affect people's lives and opportunities. He established a foundation focused on providing resources and support for deaf and hard-of-hearing children and their families. Victoria redirected some of her charitable efforts toward organizations serving the deaf community, bringing not just financial support, but also advocacy and awareness. She became a spokesperson for the importance of early sign language education for deaf children and their families. Daniel, meanwhile, flourished in ways his parents had never imagined possible. With proper communication support, he excelled academically and socially. The Morrisons enrolled him in a specialized school where he could learn alongside both deaf and hearing students, all using sign language as a common means of communication. Rosa's role in the family evolved as well. No longer just a housekeeper, she became Daniel's sign language tutor and cultural bridge, helping the family understand not just the mechanics of sign language, but the rich culture and community that surrounds it. Richard insisted on significantly increasing her salary and providing educational benefits for her own children and grandchildren. Most importantly, the Morrison mansion was no longer a silent monument to success, but a home filled with conversation, laughter, and genuine connection. The family began hosting gatherings for other families with deaf children, creating a community where communication barriers were removed and relationships could flourish. The wider impact word of the Morrison family's transformation spread through their social circles and beyond. Richard began speaking at conferences about accessibility and inclusion in the workplace, sharing his personal story of discovery and change. His company developed new technologies specifically designed to improve communication accessibility, including real-time sign language translation software and improved captioning systems. Victoria used her influence in high society to promote awareness about deaf culture and the importance of early intervention and support for families. She organized fundraising events that brought together celebrities, business leaders, and members of the deaf community, breaking down barriers and building understanding. Daniel became something of a young ambassador for deaf culture, speaking, through interpreters, at schools and community events about his experiences. His artistic talents found new expression as he created visual narratives about deaf experiences and the beauty of sign language communication. The family's story was eventually featured in major media outlets, not as a tragedy overcome, but as a celebration of communication, understanding, and the power of inclusive love. They used their platform to advocate for policy changes in education, healthcare, and workplace accessibility. The true hero emerges. Throughout all of these changes and successes, one truth remained constant. Rosa Delgado had been the catalyst for everything. Her simple act of kindness, teaching sign language to a lonely child, had transformed not just Daniel's life, but the entire family's understanding of communication, love, and human connection. Rosa never sought recognition for her role in the family's transformation. She continued her work with quiet dignity, taking pride in Daniel's achievements and the family's growth, while maintaining her humble perspective on her contribution. When pressed by reporters or documentary makers who wanted to tell her story, she would simply say, "I just helped a little boy talk to his family. Any parent would do the same." But Richard and Victoria knew better. They understood that Rosa had done something extraordinary. She had seen potential where others saw limitations, had offered patience where others might have given up, and had built bridges where others saw only barriers. In recognition of her impact, the Morrisons established the Rosa Delgado Foundation for Communication Accessibility, providing sign language education, resources, and support for families affected by hearing loss. Rosa initially resisted having her name associated with the foundation, but eventually agreed when she understood that her story could inspire other caregivers, teachers, and family members to recognize the communication potential in every child. Lessons in Unexpected Heroism. The story of Daniel Morrison and Rosa Delgado illustrates profound truths about heroism, communication, and human connection. Heroes don't always wear capes or perform dramatic rescues. Sometimes they simply pay attention when others look away, offer patience when others are rushed, and build bridges when others see only walls. Rosa's heroism lay not in any single dramatic gesture, but in her consistent commitment to seeing Daniel as a whole person, deserving of real communication and connection. She recognized that his deafness was not a limitation to be pitied, but a difference to be understood and accommodated. The transformation of the Morrison family demonstrates that wealth and success, while providing resources and opportunities, cannot substitute for genuine human connection and communication. All the money in the world couldn't solve Daniel's isolation, but one person's willingness to learn his language and teach it to others changed everything. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows that communication is not just about words or sounds, it's about understanding, patience, and the willingness to meet people where they are, rather than demanding they adapt to our preferred methods of interaction. The ongoing journey today, 5 years after that pivotal afternoon when Richard discovered Rosa and Daniel in the library, the Morrison family continues to grow and learn together. Daniel, now 13, is thriving academically and socially. He has become fluent in both American Sign Language and written English, and has developed a passion for technology and innovation that rivals his father's. The family takes annual trips together, exploring different countries and cultures, with Daniel serving as their guide to accessibility and inclusion in travel. They have visited deaf schools and communities around the world, learning about different sign languages and cultural approaches to deafness. Richard has stepped back from some of his business responsibilities to spend more time with his family and his foundation work. Victoria has become a nationally recognized advocate for deaf education and accessibility rights. And Rosa, now in her late 50s, has become a sought-after consultant and speaker on childhood development and inclusive caregiving. But perhaps the most meaningful change is the simplest one. The Morrison home is now filled with conversation. Family dinners stretch for hours as they discuss everything from Daniel's latest art projects to current events to plans for the future. The silence that once defined their mansion has been replaced by the rich visual conversation of sign language and the laughter that comes from genuine understanding and connection. Daniel often reflects on how different his life might have been if Rosa hadn't entered it. In a recent interview for a documentary about deaf culture, he signed, "Rosa didn't just teach me sign language. She taught me that I had a voice, and she taught my family how to listen." This remarkable story reminds us that heroes come in all forms, sometimes as humble housekeepers who see potential where others see limitations, sometimes as children who persist in seeking connection despite barriers, and sometimes as parents who find the courage to change and grow. In our own lives, we all have opportunities to be unexpected heroes, to build bridges of communication and understanding, to see the whole person behind any perceived limitation or difference. What stories of unexpected heroism have touched your life? Have you witnessed moments when someone's simple act of kindness or understanding transformed a situation? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire others to recognize the heroic potential in everyday acts of compassion and connection.